G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Joshua. This has been prepared from a study from the commentary of Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the founder of RL Ministries. Thank you for coming along. We're into session 4 of the book of Joshua. We're going to get through chapter 5, verse 4 down to chapter 6, verse 27. Now, just a quick recap. The wilderness generation under the leadership of Joshua have now crossed over the Jordan in a miraculous event. The Ark of the Covenant, carried by the priests, entered the flooded Jordan and the waters parted for them. And this was a sign that just as God was with Moses, we now see the evidence of God being with Joshua. And just as Moses parted the Red Sea with a rod, Joshua would part the river with the ark. And the result is the authentication of God's mediator before the people, and that's now Joshua. All Israel crossed over into the land of Canaan on dry ground, and once the priests left the riverbed, the waters resumed their natural and original flow. Now, with this crossing over, the people were now committed to war because they're now on the other side of the Jordan River in enemy territory. They're also committed now to walk by faith in the living God and to turn from walking according to the flesh as they had often done in the wilderness. Can't do that anymore on this side of the Jordan. 2 memorials were set up with stones from the riverbed as a remembrance of what God had done. And one memorial was in the midst of the Jordan River where the priests stood, and the other in a place called Gilgal on the east border of Jericho where the Israelites camped. And the purpose of the second set of stones was to teach the children in subsequent generations what God did at this time. The drying up of the Jordan was heard by the Canaanite kings and the Amorite kings, so both east and west of the Jordan, and this caused great terror among them because of what the God of Israel had now done. Having crossed into the land, the Israelites now have to circumcise the men as a sign of obedience to the Abrahamic covenant, because in the wanderings they had not practiced circumcision. Crossing of the Jordan showed that they were now restored to the divine favor of God, and now since they were to experience the covenantal experience of the promised land, they were now to receive the token of the covenant, which was circumcision, since they would now enter the land of promise. And so we're moving on, and where we are today, we're now looking at continuing with the circumcision of the people. In verses 4 to 7, we have the explanation. In verse 4, he deals with the Exodus generation, and this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise. All the people that came forth out of Egypt that were males, even all the men of war, died in the wilderness by the way, after they came forth out of Egypt. So, in verse 5 here, we have the contrast of the two generations, the Exodus generation and the wilderness generation. It says, for all the people that came out were circumcised. So that's the Exodus generation. They came out. Circumcision was practiced in Egypt. They came out. But all the people that were born in the wilderness by the way, as they came forth out of Egypt, they had not circumcised. And that was the wilderness generation. Now, what's being said here? To summarize it, first of all, those who came out of Egypt were circumcised. They practiced circumcision in Egypt. But second, all those who stood at Mount Sinai, remember when they got the law, were also circumcised, which shows that those born in that period after the Exodus were circumcised, which shows that the practice of circumcision continued after the Exodus. But third, this new generation that just crossed into the land was not circumcised. Now in verse 6, he focuses now on the sin of Kadesh Barnea. And the fact is that what we see here in verse 6, for the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the nation, even the men of war that came forth out of Egypt, were consumed. Why? Because they hearkened not unto the voice of Jehovah, unto whom Jehovah swore that he would not let them see the land which Jehovah swore unto their fathers that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So, of the Exodus generation, those who were 20 years or older, they all died outside the promised land. They died in the wilderness. And the reason was that they had not believed God, and their unbelief resulted in disobedience. Therefore, God sentenced them to death outside the land, a land that he had promised their ancestors and that was flowing with milk and honey. So because of their disobedience, because of their lack of faith in God, these men 20 years and older perished in the wilderness. They were the fighting men. 5 observations here. First of all, the Exodus generation was sentenced to die in the wilderness, and they would not receive the promised land. The sentence was pronounced on the whole generation that came out of Egypt from the age of 20 years and upward, so anything over 20. They did not live up to the meaning of the token of the covenant and therefore would not benefit from the circumcision. Second, not only was the Exodus generation sentenced to die in the wilderness, but the wilderness generation had to bear the consequences of the sin of Kadesh Barnea, and did so by living a nomadic life for 40 years until the Exodus generation all died in the wilderness. So during those 40 years, they had to bear the punishment along with their fathers before entering the promised land. And the only difference was that they alone survived the period, except for Caleb and Joshua, obviously. Now, third, since the wilderness generation had to live for 40 years with the punishment of Kadesh Barnea, for that reason they did not circumcise for those 40 years. So this means the sons of the rejected generation did not receive the covenant of circumcision. But this did not mean that the covenant itself was null and void, not at all. God still preserved the people of Israel as a national entity. For only one generation was actually rejected, and that was the Exodus generation, 20 years old and upward. But the nation as a whole was not and could not be in light of the unconditional nature of the Abrahamic covenant. So they were not rejected as a whole. Fourth of all, circumcision was thus now suspended until the divine sentence of Kadesh Barnea was fulfilled. And the practice of circumcision had ceased as of Kadesh Barnea. And fifth, now that the new generation has entered the land in keeping with the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant of circumcision is to be now renewed as an act of obedience to the Abrahamic covenant. Okay. We now see in verse 7, we have the circumcision of the wilderness generation. First of all, we see the act. The children whom he raised up in their stead, then did Joshua circumcise, for they were uncircumcised because they had not circumcised them by the way, and that's in the traveling. No circumcision since Kadesh Barnea. One observation here is that somewhere between 670 and 720,000 males were all circumcised on this one day. And then in verse 8 we have the healing. And it came to pass when they had done circumcising all the nation. See here it says nation. Nation in Hebrew called Goy, G-O-Y. Again, we see here Goy is being used of Israel. And because normally the nations would be the Gentiles. The rabbis explain this as follows. They say the text again uses the word Goy to imply that even the slaves captured in the time of Moses in the battle with the Midianites were circumcised on that day. And in order to recuperate from the process, it says that they abode in their places in the camp until they were whole, until they were healed. So the rabbis came up with this explanation. But Scripture tells us that they were circumcised and they remained in their homes until they were all healed up. Now, 3 observations here. First of all, we see the fear of the Canaanites described in verse 5. Described in chapter 5, verse 1, It kept these Canaanites from attacking the Jews during their weakened condition here. And second, this was divine protection, because remember what happened at Shechem in Genesis 34, where when the Jews got the city of Shechem to circumcise themselves, they went and attacked them. And this could also happen to the Jews at this point in time. So this was divine protection, second thing. Third, the circumcision now qualified them to keep the Passover, because Exodus 12:48 says, no uncircumcised person may eat the Passover. That's Exodus 12:48. So they have to be circumcised to be able to partake of the Passover. In the first part of verse 9, he deals with the reproach of Egypt. Now, again, he begins here with a divine declaration. Jehovah said unto Joshua, this day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off of you. Now, exactly what does this mean, the reproach of Egypt? The withholding of covenantal blessings was because of the lack of circumcision. Also, this removal of reproach would now counteract the Egyptian claim that God took them into the wilderness only to kill them. And that was a point made 3 times. We see that in Exodus 32:12, Numbers 14:13-16, and Deuteronomy 9:28. Now, the rabbis interpret the reproach here as referring to the foreskins. This is the rabbinic theology, not biblical theology. They say before the Exodus, the Egyptians would taunt the Jews by saying that they were uncircumcised just as we are, and therefore the foreskin was a source of shame. Now, a modern-day rabbi suggests that this refers to a statement made in the wilderness after the spies' slanderous report about the land, saying it would be better for us to return to Egypt. This is what another rabbi says. Going on, what the rabbis say, as a result of their murmuring, they no longer merited the favorable northerly winds. Once the winds stopped, they could no longer circumcise. So when God commanded Joshua to circumcise the nation at Gilgal, it became apparent that their sin of murmuring had been forgiven, and now the northerly winds started again. So for 40 years, the rabbis are saying they couldn't circumcise because the northerly winds weren't blowing to help the healing process. But all of a sudden now, they've started again. Again, rabbinic writings, not biblical writings. Now, in verse 9, now came the naming of Gilgal. Wherefore the name of that place was called Gilgal unto this day. The word wherefore here connects the naming of the town with the rolling away of the reproach of Egypt, because the biblical etymology seems to indicate here that Gilgal means rolling or rolled away, and wheel, which ultimately led to the meaning of circle. So that the name Gilgal meant circle or rolling away, and they say it was named this because of the rolling away of the reproach of Egypt, where they're now circumcised. Now we'll come to the observance of Passover. Now, children of Israel encamped in Gilgal, and they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even in the plains of Jericho. So after they are now been circumcised, it's time to observe the Passover. And it begins with spelling out the place. And the children of Israel encamped, this is now at Gilgal. Now that they've been circumcised, they're no longer called a goy. We see here they're now called what? They're now called the children of Israel. B'nai Israel, the children or the sons of Israel, no longer called goy or nation. Then comes the observance, and they kept the Passover. So this was now the 3rd observance in Israel's history. They've only had 3 Passovers. First one was in Egypt in Exodus 12, verses 1-28. Second one was a year later in Mount Sinai in Numbers 9, 1-15. But then they stopped that as well. So now, after 39 years of not celebrating Passover, for the 3rd time they once again partook of the Passover. According to Exodus 12, verse 48, circumcision was a necessary act before partaking of the Passover. The date is specified. It's on the 14th day of the month at evening, and the place is, it's in the plains of Jericho. That's where the Passover is now being celebrated. 14th day of Nisan, that's when Passover was supposed to be celebrated. Now, with the Passover happening, we now see the cessation of manna. So, the morning after Israel had eaten the Passover, God's miraculous provision of the manna now ended. Verse 11 deals with the produce of the land. First of all, the act. And they did eat of the produce of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened bread, unleavened cakes, and parched grain. And the timing is given as the self same day. So the day after Passover, which is also the first day of the feast of unleavened bread. In verse 12 comes the cessation or the end. First of all, the fact. And the manna ceased on the morrow, that is, after they had eaten of the produce of the land. Neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. So, after they've crossed the Jordan, manna now ceases, and they now start to eat the produce of the promised land. We see here also just an observation. These verses. Remember we spoke about a chiasm last time. Here we see another chiasm here. It's the day after the Passover. That very day they ate from the produce of the land, unleavened bread. That's the A. B is the manna stopped the day after they ate the fruit of the land. B, there was no longer any manna for Israel, and then, but that year they ate of the produce of the land. That's just for your interest. Second observation has to do with the significance of this. First of all, this marks the end of any connection now with the wilderness journey and with the reproach of Egypt. And so this now marks a beginning for Israel. And it's showing here that the wilderness has passed and the promised land has come. Manna is wilderness food. Grain is Canaan food. And second, there is now a new connection with Passover with the promised land. Because back in Exodus chapters 12 and 13, it served as a reminder of the Exodus, but now it will serve as a reminder of the entrance into the promised land. And the crossing into the land and the cessation of the manna will all occur at Passover. The food of the Passover and unleavened bread was now part of the harvest of Canaan. The Passover, with its consumption of the produce of the promised land, was the first step in their possession in the promised land. We're now eating the grain from the land. So three major things occurred in preparation for the conquest of the land. First of all, circumcision. What did that do? Well, that put them back under the obedience of the Abrahamic covenant. Second, the reinstitution of the Passover. And third, we now see a transition from the eating of manna, which was wilderness food, to the eating of the produce of the land of Canaan, the land of promise. Okay, now, conquest of the land we see in Joshua 5:13 right down to Joshua 12:24. So now after Israel's covenantal preparation for the possession of the land was now completed, circumcision, Passover, all those things, the people now got ready for the conquest. As we're going to see, Joshua began the attack in Jericho. He took central and southern Canaan and led his final campaign in the northern part of the country. That's what we're going to see in this long span here. However, before he engaged in warfare, he first met the captain of the Lord's hosts. Now, who is that? Okay. This is 5:13 to 6:5. Now, the word theophany describes the visible manifestations of God that are found throughout the Hebrew scriptures. Now, they came in various forms. Sometimes God appeared as the angel of Jehovah or the angel of the Lord. Other times he appeared as light, fire, or a cloud. Sometimes he used a combination of these things. Lightning and thunder and various other manifestations can also be theophanies when the omnipresent God decided to take on visible form and his presence became manifest locally. Whenever the visible manifestation of the localized presence of God took place, it is known as a theophany. Now, in rabbinic writings, it is called Shekinah or Shekinah glory, which is how we refer to it, the Shekinah glory. Now, verse 13 gives us the revelation. It gives us the occasion. Came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him, with his sword drawn in his hand. Now, the theophany with the drawn sword happens twice elsewhere. First of all, in Numbers 22, verse 23 and 31. Numbers 22, 23 and 31. And that was with Balaam. Remember Balaam? And that's in the Numbers passage. And secondly, we see it also in 1 Chronicles 21:16. 1 Chronicles 21:16. See it on Mount Moriah after the census of David. Now, that's 1 Chronicles 21:16. In both cases, the figure with a drawn sword meant the threat of divine judgment. And in the second part of verse 13 now, we have the question of Joshua. Joshua now approaches him, and Joshua went on to him, and he said unto him, are you for us or for our adversaries? And in first part of verse 14, we now have the answer. And he said, first of all, the denial. And he said, nay, meaning he's not for Israel's enemies. And then we have the affirmation. But as the prince of the host of Jehovah am I now come. The figure identified himself as a prince or a commander of the army of the Lord. Now, several reasons will be given in support of the suggestion that this was one of the pre-incarnate appearances of the messianic person. Now, this is, and so this here would be one of the pre-incarnate appearances of Messiah. Among the rabbis, there are several views, mostly angelic. I'll just give you a few of those views. One view is that this is Michael the archangel, of whom the scripture says, Michael your prince. We find it in Daniel 10:21, Michael your prince. A second view is that it is Gabriel who fights Israel's battles in a fierce manner. A third view is that it is a key angel in the angelology of Judaism known as Metatron, M-A-T-A-T-R-O-N, Metatron. And Metatron, apparently, according to them, guided the Jews on their journeys and will accompany the Messiah. He'll also accompany the Messiah. The second part of verse 14, now we have the response of Joshua. First of all, his physical response. And both of these show that this was not a common angel. First up, Joshua fell on his face to the earth. And second, and did worship. Joshua worshipped the prince, which is another indication that this was more than a common angel. But then we have, second, his verbal response. He said unto him, what saith my Lord unto his servant? And in verse 15, we have the answer of this prince. And the prince of Jehovah's host said unto Joshua, now here's a command, put off thy shoe from off thy foot, and the reason is, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. So this response again revealed that this was not a common angel, for angels do not render the ground on which they stand holy. Only God does. And in the second part of verse 15, we have the obedience of Joshua, and Joshua did so. Now, it's interesting here to compare here that Joshua's first confrontation with the angel of Jehovah was the same as that of Moses back in Exodus 3:5. Moses encountered a similar situation in Exodus 3:5. Now, rabbinic theology or rabbinic tradition, the angel came to rebuke Joshua for 3 sins. Again, not biblical, rabbinic theology. First sin is that he failed to bring the afternoon sacrifice because Joshua did not put the ark back into the tabernacle after the crossing of the river. He left it outside, fearing that he might be attacked by night, so the ark was left outside the tabernacle to protect it. But the angel reminds him that wars are fought in the daytime and not at night time. Second problem or second sin that the rabbis say Joshua committed is that they did not study the Torah that night, and it would be the Torah or the law that would bring them victory. And third, this is the rabbinic stuff I'm telling you, third, the husbands and the wives did not sleep together and they failed to procreate, and this was due to the fact that they could not come together while the ark was not returned to its place. So for these three sins, the angel came to rebuke Joshua. Obviously, the rabbinic tradition requires reading something into the text that is simply not there. But I'm just telling you this for your own interest's sake. Best response to the rabbinic interpretation of Joshua 5:14-15 is to revisit the reasons the biblical text provides in support of the suggestion that the Prince of Jehovah's host was one of the pre-incarnate appearances of the Messianic person. Joshua's physical response of falling face down to the ground in verse 14 shows that this was not a common angel. Also, Joshua worshipped the prince, which is another indication that this was more than a common angel. And lastly, the prince's response to Joshua in verse 15 again revealed that this was not a common angel, for angels do not render the ground on which they stand holy. Only God does. Therefore, this must be a pre-incarnate Messiah. Now we see the instruction in 6:1-5. Verse 1 describes the state of Jericho. The state is now, Jericho was straightly shut up. Hebrews says it this way. It says it this way. It says, Jericho did shut up and was shut up. And this was the obstacle that now had to be overcome for Israel to capture the land. Jericho controlled two main accesses into the hill country, the road to Bethel and the road to Ai, and the road to Jerusalem. Now, the reason it was so strictly shut up was because of the children of Israel. That's what it says. This was due to the fact that now Jericho knew about the spies having been there. They knew about the spies having come and gone, and they knew that a crossing of the Jordan River had taken place. And the result is none went out, none came in. And then in verses 2-5, we have God's instructions. In verse 2 is the speaker. And Jehovah said unto Joshua. You notice earlier at the end of chapter 5, he was called the prince and the commander of the host of Jehovah. But now he's called Jehovah himself. Same angel talking here. Again, this is showing that this was a theophany, the appearance of the God-man, the second person of the Trinity. The rabbis claim that God is merely speaking through the archangel Michael. That's what the rabbis say, not what the Bible says. And then going on in verse 2, God affirmed the promise he had made to Joshua. See, I have given into thy hand Jericho. The fall of Jericho would be an act of God. But it's also an act of faith according to Hebrews 11 verse 30. Because faith takes hold of the promise of God and believes in its veracity. And it takes hold of the promise of God and who he is and what he's about to do. And then he mentions, that was Hebrews 11:30. Then he mentions the king thereof and the mighty men of valor. This shows now that Jericho is prepared for war and ready to offer resistance. But God was about to deliver the city into Joshua's hands, along with its king and its fighting men. Verses 3-5, he's told what the procedure should be. Verse 3 deals with the first 6 days. The act is, you shall compass the city, all the men of war, going about the city once. Only once. Thus shall thou do 6 days. And in verses 4-5, he goes on to explain what should be done on the 7th day. In verse 4, first of all, the role of the priests. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Hebrew word for trumpets is shofroth, which is the plural form of shofar. So the verse explains here that these shofroth were ram's horns. Yovlim, ram's horns. So these ram's horns were the Jubilee trumpets of Leviticus 25 and not the silver trumpets of Numbers chapter 10. A fact that points to the nature of the war. This was not to be just a military conflict, but a religious war. 7 priests were to carry the trumpets in front of the ark. Then, the 7th day ye shall compass the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the 7 trumpets. Now, one observation to make here concerns the Numbers 7. On the 7th day, they were the marcher in the city 7 times, blowing the trumpets 7 times. Number 7 signifies completion, perfection, and totality. The verse contains 5 sevens, 7 priests, 7 trumpets, 7 days, 7 circuits, and then the 7th day. Then in verse 5, he's told the steps that should be taken. And it shall be, first up, that when they make a long blast of the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout. The results of these steps would be that the wall of the city shall fall down flat. In other words, at the cry of the Israelites, the city wall will fall downward. The final instruction was that the people shall go up every man straight before him. Since the walls fell downward, they did not collapse inward or outward, so the soldiers were able to attack straight ahead without having to climb over the collapsed wall. The Hebrew says that the wall would fall into its place, and the rabbis interpret the phrase to mean that the wall did not topple, but rather that it sank into the ground. Therefore, the men could go directly into the city without having to climb over the collapsed wall. Now we see the conquest of Jericho in verses 6 to 27. After having received divine instructions on how to conquer Jericho, it was Joshua's turn to get his men ready for war. Though the Israelites were assured of victory in their battles, they had to obey God. The successful attack against the city is now covered in these verses 6 to 27. In verses 6 to 11, we see the preparation. We have the instructions to the priests. And Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said unto them, Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of Jehovah. And in verse 7, we have the instructions to the people. And they said unto the people, Pass on and compass the city, and let the armed men pass on before the ark of Jehovah. The Hebrew word, the verb said, right? And they said unto the people, the Hebrew word said is written in the plural, and therefore it would refer to the priests speaking to the people. Right? So it's the priest speaking to the people. Hebrew pronunciation would also allow for the verb to be read in the singular as he said. Then it would refer to Joshua. It doesn't matter. Either way, it's the same thing. The content of the message remains the same. The people were to advance, march around the city, let the armed men go ahead of the ark of the covenant. In verses 8 to 9, we have their obedience. In verse 8, we have a reference to the timing of the events. And it was so that when Joshua had spoken unto the people, the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before Jehovah passed on, and blew the trumpets, the ark of Jehovah followed them. So the process that began in verse 8 continued in verse 9, and the armed men went before the priests that blew the trumpets, and the rearward went after the ark, the priests blowing the trumpets as they went. Banging all of this together, the order of march was as follows. First of all, with the soldiers in verse 9. Second came the priests carrying ram's horns in verse 6, 8, and 13. Third came the Ark of the Covenant in verse 6, 8, and 13. Fourth, some more soldiers behind it. Verse 9, 50 people of verse 7. So that's pretty much the procession. In verse 10, we're given the prohibitions. And Joshua commanded the people, saying, telling him what's forbidden now. You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, neither shall any word proceed out of your mouth. In other words, they must walk around in total silence, not speaking. And the timing is until the day I bid you shout, then shall you shout. So in verse 11, we're now given a summary of the first 6 days. So he caused the ark of Jehovah to encompass the city, going about at once, and they came into the camp, and then they lodged in the camp. Now, Jericho covers about 9 acres, so it would take about 30 minutes to march around it, and that is what the Israelites did before returning back to the encampment in Gilgal. Now we come to the 6 days. Verses 12 to 14 record the procedure that Israelites followed for 6 consecutive days, with verses 12 to 13 detailing what would occur each of these days. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of Jehovah. And the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of Jehovah went on continually and blew the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, and the rearward came after the ark of Jehovah, the priests blowing the trumpets as they went. So the verse makes 6 points here for us. First of all, Joshua gets up early in the morning. Second, the priests would pick up the Ark of the Covenant. Third, they'd take the shofar and blow them while walking ahead of the Ark. Before them marched the soldiers. A rear guard followed the Ark. Priests kept on blowing the shofar as they went. So, verse 14 summarizes the subsequent days, beginning with day 2. On the second day, they encompassed the city once, returned to the camp, and then all the remaining days. So they did 6 days. 7th day, in verse 15, is a comparison containing both a similarity to what occurred in the previous 6 days and a dissimilarity. It came to pass on the 7th day, this is the final day, that they rose early at the dawning of the day, compassed the city after the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they compassed the city 7 times. As to the similarity, the Israelites marched in the city after the same manner as on the previous 6 days. Then came the dissimilarity. On the 7th day they circled the city 7 times. And then in verses 16 to 19 we have the record of what else happened on that day, with verse 16 providing the timing. It came to pass at the 7th time when the priest blew the trumpet. And then second part of verse 16 to verse 19, we're going to see the instructions here. Joshua now is going to say unto the people. Verse 16 is a command to shout. The command, shout, for Jehovah has given you the city. Verse 17 is a statement of the Kerem curse. Kerem, C-H-E-R-E-M, curse. Declaration is now made. And the city shall be devoted, even it and all that is therein, to Jehovah. Hebrew word here is kerem, which is devoted, and it is the same as the Greek word anathema. We've heard it before, anathema. Kerem was used of individuals, animals, or possessions which were set aside for the tabernacle or later the temple. Because of what they were used, because of where they were used, these individuals or things became holy. You can check it out in Leviticus 27:28. It was also, that's Leviticus 27:28. It was also used of something to be totally destroyed, as we see in Isaiah 34 verse 2. Isaiah 34:2. It was also used of something abominable. Deuteronomy 7 verse 26. And so, basic meaning of the concept or concept here is kerem means to be set aside or to be devoted to something, either to be totally for God's use or for total destruction. Now, while people under the kerem curse were to be eliminated, objects under the curse would sometimes be destroyed, but at other times be dedicated for holy use only, as in Numbers 18:14. In this case, here in Jericho, all people and animals were devoted to destruction, and all valuables were for the tabernacle treasury in verse 19. And inclusions of the kerem curse are even it, which is a city, and all that is therein. The exclusions, there are exclusions to this now. Exclusions include the persons, and we see some persons here in second part of verse 17. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all that are with her in the house. And the reason for that is because she hid the messengers in that we sent. And so she experiences the blessings here, the blessing aspect of the Abrahamic covenant. I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. Here she's being blessed. In verse 18 is the prohibition, the command. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the devoted thing. And that's the warning. Lest when you have devoted it, you take of the devoted thing, and the result would be, so would you make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble it. So Joshua now explained to the people that if his ban, the kerem, on the spoils of Jericho, were to be disregarded, the consequences would be dire. The entire camp of the Israelites would be liable to destruction if some of them disobeyed his orders. And this statement sets the stage for us coming up in chapter 7 when we get there. Verse 19, we have the the dedication. And the object we see here. But all the silver and gold and vessels of brass and iron, these are the devotions, are holy unto Jehovah. They shall come into the treasury of Jehovah. And in verse 20, we have the fall of Jericho. Two acts we see here. First up, so the people shouted, and the priest blew the trumpets. And it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet that the people shouted with a great shout. And then the fall, and the wall fell down flat. Hebrews says the wall fell into its place. It all collapsed except for that portion that had Rahab's house. And Hebrews 11:30 tells us that the walls fell by a supernatural event. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been compassed about for 7 days. That's Hebrews 11:30. Once Jericho's protection had been removed, the Israelites now started charging straight in, and the city was taken. Then came the attack. So the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. Verse 21, we have the application of the Kerem curse. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, both young and old, ox and sheep and ass, with the edge of the sword. That's how they destroyed them. Now the question is, what was the reason for the totality of destruction? 4 reasons. First of all, the destruction was based on religious and not political or military grounds. We see this in Deuteronomy 7:26 and Deuteronomy 12:2-3. It's on the screen there. Second reason is that it was based upon a divine command. Since God is holy, righteous, and just, what he commands is also right and just, whether we understand it or not. This was commanded in Exodus 17:14, Deuteronomy 7:2 and 20, verse 10-18, and Joshua 8:2 on your screens. Third reason, it was really God who destroyed Jericho and the other Canaanite cities. Israel was only a tool in God's hands. And this comes out in Joshua 6:2 and 24:8. Fourth, the reason is clearly stated, the sinfulness of the nations and to preserve the religious purity of Israel. We find that in Deuteronomy 20, verse 18. So they're the 4 reasons for the totality of the destruction. Now we see the rescue of Rahab. Although the Kerem curse meant total destruction of Jericho, verses 22-25 record the rescue of Rahab and her family, the one exception from the ban. In verse 22 is a command of Joshua. And Joshua said unto the 2 men that had spied out the land, Go into the harlot's house, bring out thence the woman and all that she hath, as you swore unto her. And verse 23 describes the rescue. And the young men, the spies, went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brethren and all that she had. All her kindred also they brought out, and they set them without the camp of Israel. So Rahab and the family were placed outside the camp of Israel because of ritual uncleanness. So we can see by comparing it to Leviticus 14:8-9, Numbers 5:1-4, and Deuteronomy 23:3. You can see it there on the screen. In rabbinic tradition, this was necessary until they were officially converted to Judaism. That's rabbinic tradition, not biblical theology. Then in verse 24, we have the destruction of Jericho. And this is the Kerem of destruction. And they burnt the city with fire and all that was therein. Then you see the Kerem of devotion in verse 24, second part. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of Jehovah. So the precious metals and other items were placed in the treasury of the tabernacle. And then in verse 25, we have the Kerem of the house of Rahab. But Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all that she had did Joshua save alive. Now, with Rahab and her family rescued, the status of the harlot changed, and she dwelt in the midst of Israel unto this day. And this statement shows that she was still living at the time that the book of Joshua was written. Story of her rescue ends with the mention of the reason for which she was saved, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. So Rahab and her family had become devoted to the God of Israel, and therefore were no longer devoted to destruction. And so again we see that she received the blessing facet of the Abrahamic covenant. See the curse of Jericho in verse 26. Jericho had already been devoted to destruction, but now in verse 26, Joshua added an oath to the Kerem curse. And Joshua charged them with an oath at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before Jehovah that rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn shall he lay the foundation thereof. And that is the beginning part of the building of a city, right? Laying down the foundation. And then with the loss of his youngest son shall he set up the gates thereof. Foundation, first part of building a city. Second, the last stage is putting the gates on the city walls. So he'll lose the first son when he lays the foundation, the second son when he finishes the city by putting up the gates. Now, you need to talk about the fulfillment of this prophecy because it was fulfilled centuries later during the time of King Ahab. We see in 1 Kings 16, 33 to 34. Now, also, what we see here is that between Joshua and the time of Ahab, when the prophecy was fulfilled, the city was rebuilt and occupied for several periods of time. So we need to deal with this. The city was occupied for periods of time, and Joshua himself even allotted the town to the tribe of Benjamin. And yet, the curse was not fulfilled until the time of Ahab 500 years later. But notice, the city mentioned as standing and functioning in Joshua 18 to 21, Judges 3:13, and 2 Samuel 10:5. Joshua passage allots it to Benjamin. This is a city that was destroyed. And the Judges and 2 Samuel passages show it was already built and a living city on those occasions. So, did this violate the curse of Joshua? And the answer is no, because the curse of Joshua did not apply to the rebuilding of the city itself, since it was so rebuilt without the curse being applied. The Hebrew word banah, B-A-N-A-H, for builds or buildeth, often carries the meaning of refortification of the city as a fortified city. Now, examples of this include 1 Kings 15:17, 1 Kings 15:17, 2 Chronicles 11:5-6, 2 Chronicles 11:5-6, and 2 Chronicles 14:5-6. So, the setting up of the gates of a town refers to the erection of the town gates, which can only be done when a town's walls have been rebuilt. The setting up of the gates signified the completion of the city wall and therefore the restoration of the city as a fortified city, as a fortification. As for the foundations mentioned in this context, it would mean that the foundations of the city wall. In other words, the times that Jericho was rebuilt and redone and re-inhabited between Joshua and Ahab, it was simply built as a city with houses for people to live in and was not built as a walled, fortified city. A town is not founded by the erection of a number of houses upon one spot, but by the joining of these houses together into an enclosed whole by means of a surrounding wall. And so that did not violate the curse of Joshua, but the violation of the curse of Joshua and the fulfillment of the curse took place in 1 Kings 16:34, when the city was being built as a fortified city, as a foundation. I'll read 1 Kings 16:34 for you. In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof with the loss of Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof with the loss of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of Jehovah, which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. So we see there the prophecy, the curse was fulfilled when the foundation with the walls were done and the gates were put on. So both the firstborn and the youngest son died. Now we see the fame of Joshua spreads in verse 27. According to verse 27, the fame of Joshua spread quickly. So Jehovah was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. Because God was with Joshua as he had promised back in chapter 1, verse 5, Joshua's reputation spread throughout the land. Now, one observation here before we move on to chapter 7. The conquest of Jericho marked the last of the ceremonial aspects of the conquest of the land, which followed the ceremonies of circumcision, Passover, trumpets, circuits, ark, 7, etc. From now on, they're going to make use of typical military strategy from this point on. And so again, what we're seeing here is that God, or as we see the principle here, that God does not always do everything exactly the same way. From now on, he's going to employ other means than these ritual methods for the destruction of cities in the land. And that is your lot for today. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and pray strong.